So I think Dave Ryan said he might be a little late.
Right.
Did you hear from anybody else?
I've not heard from anybody else, one way or the other.
Hey, Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. I think we should have close to a full AIR contingent on the line today as well. So I think Tammy will be joining, and Bruce Baker and Jesse. So we'll see.
Great, thank you. Let's see, what are we still waiting for here? I don't see John. I don't see Jane yet. Jay, you know if is John going to be able to join us?
I haven't talked with John. I can text him though. Hold on.
Okay, thanks.
Jane and John are the only ones we're missing, right?
I think so. Yep. All right, great. Then let's we'll get things started and call to order this meeting of the Commission to Study School Funding. Today's July 13th, 2020 at 2 o'clock. And we'll begin by calling the roll of members. And I'll start off. Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund in presence. So, Mel Myler.
Mel Myler, and I'm here in Contoocook, New Hampshire, with my short-haired wife.
Okay. And let's see, Dick Ames.
Yes, I'm here and at my home in Jaffrey alone.
Thanks. Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd's here in Haverhill with my dog, Scotty.
All right. Jay Kahn.
Present in Keene. No one else in the room.
Great. Thanks, Jay. Is John Morgan on yet? Sam, we'll keep going. Bill Ardinger.
Here in Concord, New Hampshire, no one else in the room. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And Jane Bergeron.
Jane Bergeron here in Litchfield with my black lab Otis.
All right. And Corrine Cascadden.
Corrine Cascadden in Berlin, New Hampshire, by myself, alone. Home.
Right. Thanks, Corrine. And let's see, I think Dave Ryan's going to be joining us shortly. I don't see him in yet. John Beardmore.
John Beardmore in Hopkinton, alone in the room, but kids may be coming in and out because the printer's behind me.
Okay. And let's see, Iris Estabrook.
Hi, home in Barrington, husband in the basement, voluntarily.
Thanks, Iris. And Barbara Tremblay.
Barbara Tremblay and Keene, my husband's in the other room.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Chris Dwyer.
My office in Portsmouth by myself.
Great, thanks, Chris. Susan Heward.
Home in Hooksett, and it is pouring here, Dave.
Oh, wow. Wow. Somehow skirted around, got around us up here. So, and Val Zanchuk.
Val Zanchuk is alone in his office at his home in Concord.
Okay, great. Thanks, Val. And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath in Manchester, New Hampshire. My husband's in the other room and the sun is shining here in Manchester.
Great. That's good. Thanks. Thanks, Mary. And let's see, we've got a Gen 4.
Hi, Gen 4 calling in from Concord, home alone.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And let's see, we've got some, I'll go over to the Carsey School and then introduce some of our AIR team. But Bruce?
Yeah, Bruce Mallory is here, Kittery Point home office, alone by myself in the office.
Great. And Carrie?
Carrie Portree, New Hampshire Listens in Dover by myself.
Thank you. And Jordan?
Jordan Hensley, also in Dover. My fiance is in the other room, but just me here.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. And from AIR, we
Let's
have...
catch, Dave will catch Michelle as part of our team.
Michelle's. Where's Michelle?
Right underneath
there's
you.
Michelle. Sorry about that.
Michelle Holt Shannon in Dover with Jonah the cat, Archie the dog, and Pluto the puppy.
Okay. Great. And let's see. And from AIR, we've got Drew Atchison.
Hey, Drew Atchison here from AIR in Washington, D.C.
Great. And we've got Bruce Baker.
Bruce Baker here, home alone in Gladstone, New Jersey.
Great. And I see Jesse Levin.
Hi there, Jesse Levin. I am here. My wife is upstairs with our dogs, Beans and Sharky, and I'm in Pacifica, California.
Okay, great, great. Doesn't look like it's raining there. Well, I know that's a background, but
It's a little cloudy, but it'll look like this once the fog burns off.
yeah. All right. So, great. Well, thanks everybody for another summertime meeting of the School Funding Commission. I appreciate everybody's engagement on this, and I know we had a lot of homework to get through leading up to today's, I think, going to be a pretty dynamic discussion, so I'm really looking forward to it. Let's see, Jordan, how are we looking as far as access?
Looking good. Nobody has called or emailed with any issues.
Okay, super. Let's see. Before we get started, I just got a couple of things I just want to mention. That this week on Wednesday from 4 to 5 o'clock, the Commission's going to be holding its first hour-long public comment listening session. So, you know, members of the public are invited to click, raise your hand, and we'll bring you into the meeting, and you can make public statements. And we're still going to be doing 15-20 minutes of public comment at the end of our regular commission meetings too. But I think this will provide a little bit more greater opportunity. And we certainly don't you know, it may not be possible to get all the members of the commission to attend, but certainly please be welcome to do that. The Carsey School will summarize the comments, or if anybody making comments can email them directly to the schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu email address, then that makes it even easier for the team to disseminate them out to the commission. And we'll be doing another one of these in August, and then I think we'll be going to twice a month beginning in September. Is that right, Bruce?
Yeah, that's right. And Dave, I'll comment that again, this is a public comment period. There won't be, this will not be a deliberation or a work session for the commission. We're looking forward to hearing from folks that haven't had the opportunity to join us at the end of one of our regular meetings, or anybody. It won't be really a Q&A or give and take time. It really will be a time to hear from the public about what its hopes and concerns are. If you have questions, you're free to pose them, and we'll try to respond at some point, you know, further down the road to questions that might come up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, and so these public comment listening sessions are actually, they're publicly noticed. They're posted in the House and Senate calendars. They're posted on the UNH Carsey Commission website. So if we do get a quorum of the commission attending, we're still in good standing on that. But like Bruce noted, we won't be deliberating or anything like that during these meetings. So I also wanted to just sort of turn it over briefly to Mel and Jay, who I think wanted to talk about something that commission members may be interested in putting on their calendar for next week.
Sure. Want me to lead there? Mel, you fill in and help me out. So we've got some guidance on school startup that has been issued. I think that that's been shared with the commission, but there is a website at the Department of Education on the START Commission. Those 15 slides that they've presented are consolidated now down to a 2-page summary, and additional guidance from the commissioner, I think, has been shared with the governor. In any case, I expect that sometime this week there'll be further guidance issued for school reopening. So significant to that is that the legislature hasn't been involved in those conversations, and you know, if there's going to be any kind of information sharing with legislators or any legislator comment, then doing that at least a month ahead of the start of the school year has been a thought that Mel and I have shared for both the Senate Education and Workforce Committee and the House Education Committee. So next Tuesday morning from 9 to noon, we are going to convene our 2 groups via a Zoom meeting. The participants will be limited to legislators and the invited presenters, which would lead off with Commissioner Edelblut, and then transition into other more panel-like presentations, but starting with school superintendents arranged by the School Administrators Association, something relating to school employee concerns, which would be teachers, custodian contract employees, the full gamut of tutorial staff, et cetera, administrators. Then into a session about special access kinds of programs where there's been concern about access. That would include special education, career technical education, transportation, and interscholastic athletics. Then we'll transition to a policy conversation, concerns about policy and guidance that will involve school board association, and then leave some time for committee discussion to see if we've adequately sprinkled information on startup topics sufficiently for the legislative members of our 2 committees, or if we feel that we need to have a subsequent conversation. But at least we want to get this started, and relative to this commission, Dave thought that this would be valuable to hit your calendars, and we'd invite you or other members of the public to listen in much the same manner that they're listening in to our conversation today. The Senate calendar notice will go out on Thursday, and Mel, the House calendar notice, I think, is going to be a special update that occurs this week, right?
Yeah, this session is really kind of an information gathering session to kind of share what everybody's been involved in, et cetera. And Jay and I just thought it was important to have an opportunity to share that with the respective legislative committees on education. So I'm excited about it because it's an opportunity to gather basically the respective parties together to really kind of talk about what are we going to do on the opening of school. So it should be a very informative session.
Mel, can you just comment briefly on the relevance to this commission's work?
Well, one of the things that we're obviously concerned about And I mean, I think Jay can speak to the issue on the whole question of adequacy regarding the availability of access for all students to ensure that whatever we decide to do throughout the state, that there's equity around the issue of access for students to achieve the same kind of education that we've been talking about here. And so our concern, or at least my concern, is to make sure that those areas of high density population, for example, have the tools if in fact there is remote learning, and also in those remote areas that there's the kind of broadband width that's available for students to be able to work from home, et cetera. So there is a relationship between what we're looking at here and also the opening of school under this whole pandemic crisis that we're all facing.
So that is July 21st, so next Tuesday, starting at 9 a.m. And we can make sure everybody's got the link to access that Zoom meeting. And we'll, we've got work group meetings on Thursday this week. We're going to have another full commission meeting on Monday next week. So we'll all be getting together several times before the joint House Senate committee meeting. So good. Bruce, just very quickly reminding people of group agreements.
Sure, I'll just post them up here on the screen very quickly. You're all familiar with them by now. This will be particularly useful today as we enter into our conversation about what we're learning from some of the material provided by AAR. But we'll continue to keep an open mind. That's probably one of our most important tasks as we consider all the ways to solve a very complicated problem. Listening first to what each other has to say. It's fine to disagree. We don't personalize it. We focus on the idea, not the person. We assume and accept working through conflict, particularly as we go further into our work as a commission. But we see that conflict as actually an opportunity to be more creative and to learn from each other. It's okay to put issues like race and class on the table as we think about equity for all students in our state. We'll be purposeful, to the point, and concise, and pay attention to whether our comments are relevant to the question at hand. Taking risks and be raggedy, making some mistakes, and we all share responsibility for making this a productive conversation. So this is a democratic environment and grappling with the democratic process. So thanks, Dave.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Let's see, before we get started with today's discussion, just wanted to see if everybody had a quick chance to review the minutes from last Tuesday's meeting, July 7th. And if so, I would take a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll move to
I'll move that.
the minutes.
All right, motion's been made by Rick Ladd, seconded by?
Mary Heath will second.
By Mary Heath. And are there any edits, amplifications, deletions, corrections, anything anybody want to add? I did notice Bill Ardinger's name was misspelled.
I have no correction, not particular.
But if you're okay with the way it is, I don't think there's no ambiguity there as to who it's referring to. So
no worries, thank you.
All right. So quick roll call to approve the minutes. Luno is yes. Myler?
Yes.
Ames?
Yes.
Ladd?
Yes.
Khan?
Yes.
Is Morgan on?
Senator Morgan, he had a death in the family, and if he doesn't join us today, I'll catch him up.
Okay, no, we'll be thinking of him, so thanks, Jay. Ardinger?
Yes.
Bergeron?
Yes.
Cascadden?
Yes.
Don't know if David Ryan's on yet. Beardmore?
Yep.
Estabrook?
Yes.
Tremblay?
I was absent for that one, but I'll still say yes.
Great. Huard?
Same response, absent, but yes.
Okay, great. Dwyer,
Yes.
Zanchuk,
Yes.
Heath.
Yes.
All right, great. So that the minutes are approved. And Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you now to drive us and with you and Michelle facilitating the discussion of the brief. So, we're in your hands.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It may be dangerous, but today it was really one of the first commission meetings in some time where we haven't had outside presenters. So it's an opportunity for us to really have a share with each other what we're learning at this point, particularly today, because we haven't had the chance. We'll hear your views on what you think is relevant from some of the more recent briefs that AIR has provided to us. And in the agenda that went out, we asked you to take a look especially at 4 of those briefs: the National Review of State School Funding, and then the 3 vignettes that AIR chose to be relevant to New Hampshire's situation from a variety of criteria from Kansas, New Jersey, and Vermont. Because of this format and because of time constraints, we're going to provide a little bit of structure, some structure around the way that we'll engage in the conversation. Drew Atchison of AAR is going to start by providing a somewhat high-level overview of the contents of those 4 briefs to reground us all in the key messages, key information, and also to share with public folks who may not have had a chance to look at those briefs yet, make sure that they understand what it is we're referencing. And then Michelle's going to walk us through, facilitate us through a way to share your thoughts. And I'm going to ask Michelle right now to describe briefly what that's going to look like so people can anticipate this process that we're going to use to make sure we hear from everybody.
So we're going to, after the presentation from Drew, we're going to basically do 2 rounds. And in the first round, each of you will have a couple of minutes, and we'll ask you to do a little bit of just, as Drew is talking and just from your own reading, what are the key takeaways that, they're most important to you after reading these briefs, after hearing Drew talk. So we'll get a couple of minutes from each of you in that first round. And then the second round, it's sort of, one more go at it after you've heard your colleagues, a chance to chime in again. You can pass, but just, want to hear, what kind of things are standing out to you and where we're at in terms of what's relevant with the work going forward. And we'll have a little bit of a whole group conversation at that point. But we'll do those 2 rounds first before we do a whole group conversation.
So this will be a little bit structured, and that is there won't be an opportunity for give and take or response to each other's comments until the end of the 2 rounds. And we'll just call on you. Michelle will call on you based on the screen to then have your, make your comments, and then we'll pass it on. Michelle will call on the next person after that. So thanks for your patience with that slightly structured process, but we thought that was the most efficient way to use our time this afternoon. So with that, I'll turn it over to Drew, and then Michelle.
All right, thank you. I'll give just a quick overview, and then Tammy was actually the leader on the state scan and is the Vermont expert here, and Bruce, having taught college in both Kansas and New Jersey, is the Kansas and New Jersey expert here. So I'll see if they have anything else to add when I'm done with my brief comments here. But I mean, so the state scan was really just an example, or meant to provide you with a big overview of what are the types of costs that different states are adjusting for in their funding formulas, and what are the mechanisms by which they're making those adjustments, so that we defined the big costs as student needs, size, sparsity, and transportation kind of all run together, grade ranges, and then the prices of resources, whether certain areas are high cost of living or have particular aspects about those areas that make it more expensive to hire teachers, So those are the big 4 buckets of costs that we defined. And then as far as mechanisms, we looked at whether states fund those costs within a funding formula through the use of weights, and sometimes through other mechanisms, flat dollar amounts, or whether they fund them kind of outside of the traditional funding formula through separate categorical programs. So it's really just a big picture look at what are the types of things that states are doing. And then we went into a little bit more detail about some of the New England states that you all are probably most familiar with. When we get into our state vignettes, I'll go into a few takeaways that I found important from each state. I'll start with Kansas. So for Kansas, one of the interesting things about Kansas is that it was one of the first states that explicitly accounted for student outcomes in its attempt to measure adequacy. So other states had previously taken more of a inputs-based approach. What are the student ratios we think are necessary? What are the other non-personnel resources we think are necessary, and simply added those up. Well, Kansas said, let's look at the outcomes first, and let's figure out what we really need to spend to achieve outcomes. And they weren't looking at just minimal outcomes. They were looking at the outcomes that were set by the state in their standards. Another takeaway from Kansas is that translating cost analysis into legislation is an imperfect process. The resulting cost analyses were overly complicated, and making those complex formulas simpler is often necessary, and there's also political compromise and political feasibility that need to come into the question when you're thinking about a formula. And the other thing, I think at the end of the day, Kansas balked at appropriating the necessary funding to really implement the formula, and that resulted in more court cases down the road. So if you want to get out of the never-ending cycle of court cases, then you really have to do something meaningful. So the next vignette was New Jersey, and this was interesting for a number of reasons. As Dr. Kenyon mentioned last week, New Jersey is a state where there have been very prescriptive court cases, and New Jersey's court cases, I think, were prescriptive in a little bit of a different way, in that they really prescribed very specific remedies to take insofar as implementing pre-K programs and incorporating facilities funding into the definition of adequacy. Whereas for New Hampshire, the prescription, as far as in my current understanding, is more on the tax equity side, and that there really has to be really the way that the taxes work is very prescriptive in New Hampshire, and that they have to be uniform across the state, and things like that. New Jersey was an iterative process, so they started out with really focusing on the high needs districts, and then they evolved into more of a statewide funding formula. The statewide funding formula, like Kansas, made some compromises, and the compromises tended to somewhat disadvantage the high needs districts. But again, compromises often have to be made in the sake of passing legislation. And despite the compromises, the end product was progressive compared to most states, and is a good example of a classic foundation formula. Lastly, Vermont. Vermont is a different beast. So they, rather than focus on progressiveness in terms of student funding, Vermont was largely focused on tax equity. The way that Vermont applies weights is very different from many other states, in that the weights really affect tax rates rather than affect direct district funding. Vermont also provides some interesting examples that I think are relevant to New Hampshire. Several of the previous presentations talked about things like circuit breakers and ways that you can reduce the burden of property taxes for low-income residents that own property. And Vermont has an interesting example of combining income and property values to set tax rates that provide, that reduce the burden for low-income property owners. And lastly, Vermont is an example of a state that has a statewide property tax, and I think that will be something that comes up for the commission as you all think about how to fund the cost of an adequate education. And with that, I'll pause for a second and see if Tammy and Bruce have anything to add on top of those comments.
I would add that actually Kansas also has an underlying statewide property tax that is kind of analogous to the base rates for Vermont, although it's just a specified rate that helps support that foundation formula. I do think, I mean, Drew really hit an important theme here, one that we've been trying to resolve, and we tried to kind of fill this void in our Vermont analysis. That in New Jersey, they did originally an input-based analysis of a couple of different prototypes in like 2001, 2. That actually got buried until the state kind of rewrote the report and then rewrote a second report to build a formula on those input-based analyses. And they had a lot of gaps to fill in translating these tallied up costs of prototypes into a formula that could serve all the different types of schools and districts in New Jersey. Right? So there were a lot of gaps in getting from the analyses of cost to the policy that was a funding formula. It's a little less complicated to go from a cost model. What was unique about Kansas, there had been other states that did like average spending of districts that met certain outcome targets. That's the basis of the New York formula. And New Hampshire, I believe, immediately post Claremont was doing some of the same types of analyses of average spending of schools that got certain test scores and outcomes, but that wasn't the richness of trying to estimate a full cost model. Now, it should be fewer steps between getting from a cost model to legislation, in that a cost model comes up with estimates of district costs for every district in a state that can more, so it's not like you only have 4 or 5 different prototypes that you're trying to translate into a formula. You have an estimate for everyone. Kansas, though, kind of left a gap in between in their process. One, in the first study, they had asked Bill Duncombe and John Yinger from Syracuse only to estimate the underlying general fund budget cost, excluding transportation and special education, and even excluding some other additional funding sources. And they had to then add those back in through a collaborative process with their own legislative research division. Now, to their credit, the legislative research division in Kansas during that period was really a model compared to many other states that I've worked with. I worked in Texas and a whole bunch of other states, but that legislative research division was great. They did the best they could, but it was a very kind of cumbersome process to go from the cost model to a formula, adding in those additional pieces. The thing we tried to do in Vermont, because in theory it should be easier to get from a cost model to a formula, was to estimate the cost model and then to come up with a simplified model that accurately predicts those same cost model results that could operate as a formula. We filled the gap by constructing a formula that replicated the cost model with base and weights as a typical foundation formula works, to try to fill that void. And I think that's what we would be trying as well to do for you guys. That, because Drew raised a really critical issue there, that getting from a rigorous empirical analysis to adopted legislation is tricky. I believe the more space you leave in between the analysis and the legislation for stuff to go awry, the more stuff will deviate when you go from, so we try to provide that in-between step in our analyses now of how can we design a formula that replicates what the cost model predicted. To be honest, we were trying that back in like 2001, 2002 on analyses for Texas that never eventually influenced policy. So we've been spinning our wheels for decades, but I feel like we've made some progress, in particular on filling the void in Vermont.
May I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So I thought I just think there are two other things, and I'd like to add to Drew's excellent synopsis. And the first thing is with respect to the state policy scan. And I think a key takeaway from that the commission might want to think about and talk more about is that, right, that there is no silver bullet. There's no consistent model across states that says this is how we take into account differences in costs. And that's both in terms of the kind of adjustments, but also the mechanisms that they use in the formula to adjust for costs. And so I know in listening to commission discussion thus far, there's been a lot of talk about trying to think about that piece and, what are other states doing? I think it's important that to look at the state policy scan is offering sort of this national profile, but a key thing that comes out of that national profile is that everybody does something a little bit different. There's certainly some common themes that we identify in the profile, but the decision is largely based on local context, in this case, state. So that would be one thing I think is just important to keep in the back of our minds. And then with respect to Vermont, I think a key takeaway from Vermont also is in addition to the statewide property tax and the equity and sort of taxpayer equity component that Drew mentioned is I think it's important to remember how decisions about spending are made in this state. And that is, right, the state doesn't have an adequacy standard, right? We don't run a foundation formula. So every school district makes a decision about its budget. And then all those budgets are tallied up, and then, right, the statewide property tax rates are set with some weighting that goes on for differences in costs across districts. But what that means is underlying all of this, underlying the formula is this assumption, two important assumptions. One about local control, right? That localities still have a great deal of discretion in making decisions about not just how much they spend, but what they spend it on. And two, that local school boards are making decisions to adopt budgets that provide an adequate education for their students, right? And so we can all think about, local school boards with their best intentions, but remember also that those budgets are voted on by voters. And so there's this constant tension between, right, constraining costs and making sure that you have enough money in the budget. But the underlying assumption for the entire formula is that those budgets that are passed by local voters reflect the cost of an adequate education as determined by the local school board. And that's a really different model than what you see in other places. And I think that's relevant because New Hampshire being next door, there's also a strong sort of sentiment for local control. And there are trade-offs with that model. So I think it's also important just to remember that that's a really important piece of how Vermont's formula works when you think about it. Happy to answer more questions, but I thought I'd add those two additional points.
I think that's it for our team. So I'll turn it back to Michelle to get the discussion going.
Okay, thank you. I want to give everybody actually, a good solid minute or two just to jot a few thoughts down, thoughts from the presentations, look back over the briefs that you read. And so I'm going to give it a minute. This is a treat for the introverts to have a little moment.
Michelle?
Yes.
While people are working on that, could I ask I don't know, just a question of probably Drew or Bruce or Tammy or Jesse. I think it was talked about in the national scan, and I think I understand. I think because I've been reading enough about this that I understand the weights, and if I understand it right, if a certain characteristic has a weight of 0.5, that would mean that student's ADM weight would be a 1.5. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, generally that's correct. We always try to say whether our weights are centered at 0 or centered at 1, because like you said, a weight, if someone says the weight is 1.5, if it's centered at 1, then that means 50% more, or states could define their weights as 0.5, and that means 50% more. So it really kind of varies how the state defines it, but yeah, I mean, that's the right way to interpret it.
Okay, and then it just wasn't clear to me how weights differ from census-based approach.
Yeah, so a census-based approach really doesn't differentiate across districts by the actual counts of students in those districts that have a particular need. So for special education, if it's funded on a census-based approach, then the state assumes that each district has the same percentage of special education students and then funds each district in the same way. And the reason why states might do that for things like special education or for gifted and talented is that those programs are somewhat more subjective in how you identify students, and there's a little bit more leeway as to whether districts identify a lot of students that are special ed or gifted and talented, or not very many in those categories. So it kind of guards against the incentive that to identify a whole lot of students. So if you say that special education students cost 3 times more, and you're going to provide 3 times more funding for special education students, then some districts might have the perverse incentive to say, oh, I'm going to identify a whole lot of special education students now because I'm going to get more money. So that's kind of the reason for census-based approaches, although they're less effective at actually differentiating across districts for the real needs of students in those districts.
If I may, I'll chime in. Dave, the other thing to consider is that a census-based formula typically is based on the total number of students in a district, not the total number of students with a particular characteristics. So for example, in New Hampshire, you have flat grants that are just dollars based, right? So that's a key thing. In special education, for example, Vermont just went to a census-based formula for special ed in Vermont. And certainly that all special education formulas have incentives and disincentives around, identification and service delivery. But the other rationale that is sometimes used for census-based funding is because it's a broader pot of money. It's not targeted to a particular student. It also allows districts to spend those dollars on non-disabled students, for example. So you can provide early intervening services without having to have a student with an IEP. And again, there are trade-offs with that. There's no such thing as a perfect funding formula, and all formula have their own incentives and disincentives with them. So the key thing to think about with census versus a flat grant, the way I like to think about it is on what is the grant base, right? Sorry.
Go ahead. I think I was frozen, or we were all frozen for a moment. I think I interrupted you, Tammy.
That's okay. I'm fine. I'm happy to answer more questions. I just want to make sure that's the key distinction. But it's also used because it almost operates a little with a categorical program. It almost operates like unrestricted dollars, right? That you would have, and it allows local schools have more flexibility in how they spend those dollars that they might have in other kinds of sort of categorical public finance structures. And again, there are trade-offs with that, right? There's no silver bullet here.
So I'm gonna go ahead, Bruce, and then we're gonna zoom back out and go to our first round.
I was going to say that there are ways, there are separate issues that Tammy's teasing out there. One is that flexibility in the use of the dollars, and the other is the targeting or not of the dollars. On the flexibility of use, that can also be achieved by using special education weights on a general formula, and that funding can still be fungible, right? So it's not that census base necessarily has to be coupled with that and other methods not. A weighting on special ed students on the general formula can also provide for flexible funding. The census-based thing, ultimately its usefulness comes down to the extent to which we believe there is or is not real legitimate variation in needs by special ed populations across districts. And if you have to start making adjustments and then the exceptions become the rule, that's when you have to really rethink your formula strategy. I've been a strong critic of census. So you got people at opposite ends of the polls here. I've written a number of critical academic articles on census-based funding.
All right.
Thanks.
So I'm gonna have us go into that first round, and this, you can kind of think of this as getting those initial takeaways out, so everyone gets a chance to talk for a couple of minutes. I'll have a timer on, and then we'll go back around, and then we'll do more of an open discussion. So this is just to get lots of thinking out. I'm just gonna go across the bottom of my screen, which right now puts Val Zanchuk as going first, which maybe doesn't happen all that much for a guy with the last name with a Z.
No, I've had all those reverse alphabetical order things in first grade to get rid of that bias. Well, it seems like there are a number of sort of common methods of approaching this with the assumption that there is a similar response almost across all locales. And I guess what keeps bugging me about this thing is that assumption. It seems to be, if we spend this many dollars, we're going to get this many, units of result. And I keep thinking about the root cause of the problem. And I think every one of these methods does not get to a root cause. And I suspect that the root cause may vary quite a bit with locale. It's not necessarily, I think, dollars spent, it's how the dollars are spent. And if I go back to the reaching higher analysis, and they came up with 3 factors that influenced the outcomes. One was, family financial condition. The second was community resources, and the third was teacher salaries. And when they looked at outcomes versus all those things, all those things correlated. And, from what we can do, we probably can't do much to influence, family finances, and we probably can't do much to influence resources, but we could do something to influence teacher salaries. And, to me, it just seems like that may be one of those areas where it is a root cause of a number of problems. And, is there some mechanism, in our power to recommend things that would say, if we got rid of the root cause problem of incredible disparities in teacher salaries, could we avoid some of all these outcome issues that we're trying to resolve? And, if, for example, there were
Couple more seconds.
Okay, a specified base salary across the state so that a teacher in Berlin would not be driven to move to Exeter because of salary if they enjoyed teaching in the Berlin district, we could avoid a lot of the turmoil and inefficiencies of, pool of inexperienced teachers being moving every couple of years because they're moving for salary. And it just seems that all these things make an assumption that we just spend money when there may be a root cause that we're not addressing.
All right, thanks, Val. Mary Heath, and then John Beardmore. Mary?
Okay, thank you. This has been a lifelong conversation, it seems to me. And for years, I've struggled with how we do this best. I really like the idea of estimating individual costs per school district, looking at the capacity to pay. Vermont is very interesting. I also, going through Vermont, I also had the experience of being with a group of legislators from Vermont who were very anxious about, ultimately, they felt they didn't have much control over how much money would be spent. So that was a big concern to them. In terms of teacher pay, when I was Deputy Commissioner, Lionel Tracy and I talked about a statewide contract for teachers, and that did not go over very well anyplace, just because of the nature of local control. I think it bears a lot of possibility, in fact, because you could have a statewide health plan, a statewide, so many things. And then it would also take away from the disparities that we see in school districts. But other New Jersey, I really particularly like what New Jersey's done, and they've seen some good outcomes as a result of their work. But basically, I think those are my immediate takeaways. I love the fact that I can't remember who said it, there's no silver bullet. And I think whatever we do, it has to be a New Hampshire brand. My concern about having things specified so closely that legislators can chop them off. And I think Iris can talk to what came from the formula that they developed. And that's, if we had kept with that formula, we wouldn't be in some of the shape that we're in now, because we took out so much and we lost so much funding. So basically, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Perfect timing. John. Did John, let's see.
Yeah, John had to drop due to
Okay.
work related. Yep.
Okay. Jane Bergeron.
Great. One of the takeaways that I gained from this was around the Kansas model in terms of basing it on student outcomes, and it raised a lot of questions for me, specifically when we think about special education. And when we look at New Hampshire and the types of data we gather statewide regarding student outcomes, it's pretty dry. It's pretty much of a desert, and beyond our statewide assessments can be varied in terms of each school district. And as we move towards competency-based education and competency-based assessments, it just raised a lot of questions for me in terms of moving towards a student outcome model.
Thanks, Jane. Bill Ardinger.
Thank you. Bruce, how can I post that one picture I wanted to identify?
I'll put it up for you now.
Thanks. So I thought these reports were excellent, and I came up with 3 brief comments. The picture on your screen is actually drawn by a report from Bruce Baker, which was the Schenker Institute Rutgers study, The Adequacy and Fairness of School Funding Systems. And what I wanted to do was look at the states that are identified and find some way of comparing them. And in that report, there were 3 kind of comparisons. One was, how hard are you working to pay for stuff? That's the first one. The second graph was, how much are you spending? Are you spending a lot on highest poverty districts? And then the third is the progressivity or regressivity of the formula that is distributing the assets. And I found that when you look at this, and you can look at it separately, that New Hampshire is situated pretty well, with the exception of the last column, where you see we have the most regressive categorization in this study. And that was shown in other things. So for me, the takeaway was that look at Massachusetts, New Jersey, Kansas, Vermont, they all had more progressive systems of focusing on poverty districts first and not focusing on districts that have greater wealth. The second issue I wanted to raise from this is accountability.
About 10 more seconds.
Sorry, Vermont did not connect its quality standards to its formula. I'd like to see ours make that connection, and Governor Lynch's proposal did that. And last, catastrophic aid. I think special education aid should be rolled into whatever integrated holistic formula we come up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Susan Hayward.
The things that struck me in looking at the different formulas was I too like the notion of outcomes-based. I don't know how one balances the need for local control, which is paramount in this state, with the needs of special education, CTE. And so I like the formulas that look at students as individuals. I don't know. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say about it.
Thanks, Susan. Barbara Tremblay.
Thank you. I really found these very interesting. And I had also seen the graphs that Bill was talking about as well. The major issue for me that I was looking through as I read these was the issue of disparity and how that is, that concept or that idea is captured in each one of these briefs we read today. Of particular concern, of course, for me are the area of poverty, the low density districts, but also are what is included. It's many of the districts talk about special ed. Many of them were talking about ELL, but what about CTE, transportation, facilities? All of those things that we keep seeing coming up and coming up and coming up, should they be included in whatever we consider to be important as a funding piece here in New Hampshire? I know that we'll be looking again at the whole idea of what is an adequate education, what is included, what is a legislator included in the past and not. Certainly preschool and a number of other areas needs to be considered. So I read with interest the different ways that the adequate education is funded from these different states, but also what they have included and talked about. I think it's an important piece for me that I just wanted to see how others were incorporating those ideas in their funding. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Rick Ladd.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, you can hear me. I really was drawn into the report from Vermont, seeing it's just, I look out my back deck and I'm looking into Vermont. I noticed that they have corrective grants over there for transportation, special education, and the third category being small schools. Then on page 3 of that report, I was reading about the quality standards, education quality standards, which Vermont has. And I really enjoyed those 9 bullets. I think those could probably be rolled right over into our state here in New Hampshire. But then I go back up a couple paragraphs above that, and I noticed that there's no connection between statute, rules, or present practice between Vermont's quality standards and its school funding formula. And so where does then the accountability come for these 3 areas of grants, but from the state level to ensure that improvement is occurring? And is there a program that Vermont has to ensure that a district that needs help with this school funding formula can get that assistance and can get that improvement from the Department of Education? So I'm concerned about, I guess, the accountability and these grants for these 3 categorical areas, which are extremely important. But how does the state ensure that improvement is occurring? Or is this just a local issue over there where they make that decision themselves and the state keeps pumping money into it?
Thanks, Rick.
So that's a fair. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, we'll come back to questions. We're going to keep up with those. Corinne Cascadden.
Okay, thank you. I'll start first at my first one. Val was talking about root cause, and then Barbara said it's based on disparity for me. You know, the city here has 65% of its property, city property, tax exempt, but has to raise the same dollar to meet the same minimum standards. But going through the samples, I mean, in terms of Kansas, the only thing I picked out that stood out was had outcome standards, which were state assessment, which we have, graduation rates we collect. But I think in terms of New Hampshire, because we are so progressive, is college and career readiness indicators that now are required to be collected from all ninth graders. So there'll be, you know, an annual measure for that. In terms of New Jersey, I think, you know, I believe strongly in universal preschool, but in terms of how it's funding concerns me, because I was always protective of those private childcare providers and small businesses that also provide childcare programs, and I didn't want to see public school close those businesses. I thought very fascinating that I haven't seen in any New Hampshire literature this idea of regional cost by county. And I don't know if there's anything that's been discussed in the past, because a lot of you have already been involved in different studies and legislation. Was there anything ever considered that was by county? Because most schools in the nation, from what I could see in another article, are run by counties. I was not a fan of placing greater weight on secondary students in terms of funding. And then in terms of Vermont, I did compare the education quality standards to the New Hampshire minimum standards. They're a little bit more broad, but there were some requirements in those standards that were a little different. The class size was much lower. What, I'm done already?
Yep, it flies.
All right, just in closing then, because I'll come back to it. The 1/3, the funding mechanism of 1/3, 1/3, one third was very intriguing to me. It seemed very clean and simple. Was a third was statewide tax, a third came from the general state fund, and a third was annual revenue. I wasn't totally a fan of homestead versus non-residential because it would affect me. And then,
Thank you, Corinne.
all right, yeah, that's good for now.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
I could be on a roll.
Chris Dwyer.
Yes, and I'll just identify some things in the different ones that you sent that intrigued me. With Kansas, I thought the idea of having this school finance council that adjusted annually for inflation was an important, interesting idea. The notion of the extreme difference in cost per pupil across their districts was of interest. And I was intrigued by this idea of not waiting on a continuous scale, but identifying some districts, specific districts that have really high needs because of poverty, and treating that more absolutely. I thought that was different than what I'd seen in others, and potentially something for us to look at, so that we're not trying to give something to everyone across the sliding scale, but we're identifying specifically those in need. I was very interested in New Jersey with calling out both the need for facilities to treat facilities and early childhood as kind of separate components that really support the quality of education in a district and need to be thought about separately. I thought in New Jersey this notion, a conceptual notion that high needs districts need supplemental programs, so that we don't look at adequacy as if it's the same for everybody. I think that's conceptually an important issue. I do believe that fair share needs to take into account both income and property wealth, and certainly they have thought about that. The sliding scale for poverty concentration, I think, is important in New Jersey. And the cautionary tale about not looking at outcomes without also looking at need, I thought was really important in New Jersey.
All right, that's time.
Could I have another second?
Another second, yep.
Okay. There's a lot to talk about in Vermont. My concern is the reality of what some of this has left Vermont with in terms of the acrimony between districts and between towns and within districts that I think has something to do with the complexity of the formula, as well as the need to trust completely in this EQS implementation. So I'd like to talk more about that.
Thanks, Chris. Jay Kahn?
Thank you. So I guess we'll come back and continue to talk about EQS in Vermont. I liked it because of its comprehensiveness. I thought it looked a lot like New Hampshire's education statutes, and so the way that it was presented, I thought, was a fair way of trying to show what's in the bushel basket of goods that schools need to deliver to its constituents and students. I'm intrigued by outcomes-driven differentials and then how those need to be simplified for legislative consumption, and I think that's a lesson from Kansas that I took away. I'm intrigued with the amount of categorical aid categories that are suggested in the various models. I think this is going to be thought-provoking for us to consider, because it starts to peel away some important elements: the special education, at-risk kids, English learners, transportation, small districts, facility costs. I mean, it just starts to, anyway, these are all basic parts of what schools are expected to have as their costs. So that was unsettled for me. I do like what Kansas did on poverty, integrating it into the distribution formula. So I thought that was wise. So those are a few thoughts I'm trying to take away. There are examples here that I don't know that they fit exactly, but they are provoking for what we ought to consider.
Thanks, Jay. Dick Ames and then Iris. Mr. Brink.
Okay, thank you. So I was very impressed and grateful for the really excellent overview in the state funding formulas, the national review, where AIR put out a framework for understanding differences in educational costs, and then went through what they had gleaned from all the different ways in which states have approached this, the various factors that sort of rise to the surface as you look at this array of school finance. And in table 1 on their this document, they lay out the different factors by category: student needs, scale and sparsity, grade range, price level of inputs. What I'd love to see is, well, let me back up one other word on this. I think I see a great advantage to an approach that starts with a base cost for adequacy that's informed by outputs to the extent that it can be, and then building on that base cost, other factors that are weighted in to get to a total adequacy cost for a particular community with its demographics and student needs, and perhaps with a price level differential or scale and sparsity differentials. I don't know. I'd love to see AIR go forward and develop for us a model that draws on the best learning as they see it. They've studied this a lot more than we're ever going to, and allows us then to tear that down or build it up. And I'm
Plus second.
pleased that they can do it, and I think they can do it. I look forward to getting it. Thanks.
Thank you. Iris?
Hi. Well, from Kansas, what struck me, not a surprise, was the whole issue of whether and how much our work should be aspirational versus how much our work should be politically feasible and fundable. And I think their experience is a good lesson to take a look at that question. In Vermont, I was struck by the fact that their work is, as was described to us in the briefing, was really more about tax equity than it was about education equity. They still have districts that spend anywhere from around $12,000 up to $32,000 per pupil. And while it may be true that money isn't everything, it's certainly something, especially as it reflects what districts are able to do with teacher salaries. So I find that alarming in the sense that I think they've left a lot of education equity issues unresolved and up to local control. What I thought Vermont was considering doing that I thought was fascinating was a new categorical grant program around mental health and childhood trauma. I think that'd be really interesting to look at. I don't know how big a program it would need to be, given what we're going through now. An awful lot of kids are going to be impacted. New Jersey, about all I took away was that I thought what the court did in creating special needs districts that were therefore in need of supplemental services was really brilliant. And I think that it's working to some extent from what I understand. I'd like to hear more about that. That's about it. My time's up.
Thanks, Iris. Okay, Dave Luno, and then Mr. Mel.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I'll be real quick on this. I was sort of coming into this thinking that solving a tax equity problem solved the problem. But I think Vermont demonstrates that's not the case. I think it's exactly what Iris was just saying. It really jumped out at me that not only does New Hampshire have to have a robust tax equity policy, but it also needs a rigorous adequacy and distribution plan as well. And so I'm just sort of really picking on Vermont, although I won't get into the stuff on Kansas and New Jersey. But the other thing that I thought was really I don't know, did not work in favor of equitable access to education is this over under on the property on spending and how that affects the property tax rate. So if you're, I think that the brief gave the example, if you spend $500 more than the state average, you're going to be taxed at essentially double the difference to make up for that. So I'm guessing that the reverse probably also works. If you spend lower than the state average, you double your benefit of spending lower. So tax equity isn't about everything. We really need to have a rigorous access equity component as well.
Thanks, Dave. Mr. Mel, and then Mary, did I get to you? Mary Heath? Okay, all right, just checking. All right, Mr. Mel?
Thank you. As I looked at this thing, the thing that was surprising to me was the issue of a base amount that would go to every school district, just a base. And then you would add on additional funding dependent upon factors, whether it be density, special ed, whatever, but that you would have some equity around what that base is, but then you could add on to that dependent upon what the particular status of that school district was in. I was intrigued with the Vermont thing, frankly, as some of the same things that Rick was talking about. And one of the things that I was also interested in was how do you deal with providing some ceiling for folks of low income. So, because as we begin to think about tax equity questions, it seems to me that that's going to be a huge issue as we begin to look at the fiscal nature of this particular problem. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I think the idea of really beginning to provide a very clear and an advocate program that would allow low-income folks or senior citizens, whatever, fixed income people, that could say, look, this is how you got a ceiling on how much school tax you're going to pay, and then provide a tax program for those who can pay. So I think the issue of the ceiling and then the grant program with a base grant was what I saw in most of these. And the other thing that was clear in a lot of these was how the hell do you get the legislature to understand exactly what we're spending 8 months going through. And I think that's going to be a real challenge at the end of our program, of how we begin to really expedite knowledge base for legislators to look at these issues that we're talking about. Thank you.
Right, thank you. All right, did I get everybody? So in a minute, we're gonna.
Did you want to get Mary?
I think she said I got her.
Yeah, you got Mary.
All right, great.
Okay. So in a second, we're going to open it up for just a large group conversation. But before we sort of dig in together, this last bit is just, do you need a minute to say something before people dig in? Anything you want to clarify or something that you want to tag on with 1 more minute? And just raise your hand if you want to do that, and I will call on you. So Mary and then Corinne.
My thoughts are, how willing are we to step outside the box of what we've been doing forever? You know, is there some opportunity to work at a county level? Could we be more creative in terms of ways to look at reducing the fees and expenses that so many school districts have? And I know that they've run into problems in many states trying to consolidate school districts, but it just seems like we have so much redundancy. And this is about children, and we know that preschool works, so there are things that we know that we need to do. So how willing are we to step out of the norm? And I think of Mel's committee and what he's doing and the purpose of it. And would this be a format to try something different, to really think about education differently, deliver it more cost effectively, and really reach the people and the needs that we need to create? Those are kind of my thoughts.
Thank you, Mary. Corinne?
I just had a question from the legislators. The goal is to end stabilization grants, and that's been the lifeline here. What is the target date for elimination of those grants again?
There's no, the grants are in place right now.
Indefinitely?
At 100%. There's no legislation to repeal that.
Right.
Yeah, you have to deal with each legislature that's going to deal with that. So you've got it for the 2 years, and what the next legislature does, that's going to be the question.
But I do think I think it's in the interest of this committee. I mean, I think the members in this commission are interested on a comprehensive, improvement to the school funding formula. I think Rick said it at the very first meeting. We can't be whittling around the edges anymore.
Right. Thank you.
All right.
The only part of the state funding statute that varies is the base adequacy by every 2-year readjustment factor. The rest of it is all set through a biennial appropriation amount. So yeah, I mean, it's all
in statute.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be reaffirmed or replaced.
Thanks, Jay. Rick and then Dick.
Thank you very much. I'd like just to follow up a little bit on the Vermont. Oh yes, stabilization was a recommendation, the first recommendation that came out of the report back in 2015, get rid of it. But in regard to Vermont here, we have so many SAUs in the state. I don't have enough fingers, toes, etc. to count them all. And we don't fund them at all within any formula. But we expect them all, whether they're 5,000 students in an SAU or over 1,500 or 2,000 students in an SAU, to provide the same services. In Vermont, they're worried about small schools. Have they done any? I know they've got consolidation because the state was mandating it. Here it's a local decision, so it's not going to happen unless the state mandates it. And I don't perceive that in the near future. But I'm curious to know whether the small schools are afforded the opportunity in Vermont to have not provide all the same services at the same level as they are in larger districts like Exeter and Barrington and Brattleboro.
Thanks. Other folks who wanted to do the chime in for, yeah, Dick.
Yeah. First on the equalization, it's essentially a hold harmless. It's essentially a finger in the hole in the dike that is there for now, but at some point we've got to move on. And then I didn't say anything about the revenue side when I spoke. I think that to me, the statewide education property tax that we have in New Hampshire needs work. I also think the concept of a statewide property tax with special features, learning from Vermont. I don't know Kansas, that was mentioned today, but that there's a lot of potential there, and we need to look very hard at the statewide property tax. I also think that it's really important, from my perspective, to separate the costing of an adequate education from the funding of an adequate education. Let's figure out how best to cost an adequate education. Let's figure out how to fund it. Let's put the two together. That may lead to movement on both sides, but we've got to figure out both and then move to make it a whole.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in before we have a large group conversation and it goes crazy? Dave.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I just really wanted to mention quickly what Mel talked about in terms of I'm calling it horizontal tax equity, but property tax relief. You know, Mel talked about caps. There may be other ways to do that too. You know, in terms of people that are living on fixed incomes, and providing some relief from the state for those families, and also, and I had this conversation with Bill earlier today. There's also people in extraordinarily complex wealth positions where they have zero income, and needing to at least consider what sort of options might be there in the interest of those families, but also in the interest of the communities that they're in, but not on the backs of not for that to fall on the backs of anybody else in the state.
Okay, so I'm gonna go to Val and then ask the AIR team if they have anything they want to answer to clarify as folks move into about a 10-15 minute conversation in the large group. Val?
Yeah, I just wanted to support something that Mary said earlier about our current condition probably would not exist if all of the previous recommendations were followed as they were, entered originally, because there seems to be so much whittling away of original intent that we keep repeating the same effort to get back to that initial point. And I think one of the things that, struck me, we've talked today a lot about, including CTE in some sort of, accommodation formula. And if you go back to the Augenblick report, 1984-85, there's a specific reference in there to the extra money that is paid to districts to support CTE, because they recognized at that time that the New Hampshire way of structuring CTE with sending districts would be a burden to those districts. And they had a formula in place, 40 years ago to, compensate for that. And yet we seem to have forgotten it or, eliminated it over time. And now we're re-recognizing the fact that we need to do this. It would seem that if we just went back to all the original reports and reiterated what they originally said, we probably would be able to put ourselves in a much better position than trying to restructure something, when I think in the past many of these issues were resolved and answered, but unfortunately compromised over time.
Thanks, Val. Anyone from the AIR team? Tammy, I interrupted you at some point, so is there any questions y'all want to clarify?
Sorry, I didn't play by the rules.
So I'll say something really quickly here. I'm from California, so we had a terrible experience with categoricals. Okay, we only maybe I guess it's been 4 or 5 years now, come out of that with our local control funding formula. So the problem with categoricals, they're well-meaning, but they also, there's an inherent negative relationship between control over how you can use your money in categoricals. So at one point we had approximately 125 different categorical programs supported by our state funds. So when you talk to the typical principal, not even the typical principal, any principal in the state, they said, listen, I have control over less than 10% of my budget. I really, I've been given basically a box full of gift cards, and one of the gift cards says I have to spend money on my school grounds. My school grounds look great. I've got books from 1962. I need books. So it's just a word of warning about categoricals and how it necessarily infringes on local control. Now, if you go with just a general unrestricted funding, like one of these foundation formulas, a base with weights, then there you really have to step up your accountability game. So I want to display that. I mean, the idea behind categoricals is that you're making sure the money is getting to where you think it's necessary, but you're imposing there. The flip side of that is providing perfect control with zero accountability at all, and you're not really sure how the money's spent or if it's being spent wisely or on the students for whom it's intended to go to. So if you have a really nice, equitable, weighted student, weighted funding formula, you also want to make sure that those services that, say for at-risk populations, are being delivered, because that's the way certain districts received their funding. Was a certain amount of funding was intentioned for at-risk students. That's my 2 cents on that. So, I mean, I don't have a good answer for you here. I just want you guys to think about it carefully, because California really screwed up, and it took us about 30 plus years before we completely overhauled our formula to get away from the categoricals. I can talk for days about how we went the categorical route. We decided to equalize down. So we said, okay, we're going to have equal funding for all districts, but we're going to set it at a very low level. And we did that by limiting our property taxes here, which we still have. So we have other problems now in terms of, limited property tax revenues going towards education. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Just a short word of warning for you, or long, as you might think.
Thank you, Jesse. We have about 10 minutes before the engagement group shares some information with you all. And I guess it's really to hear from you on, what's most important that you want to keep in mind from this discussion. And David, feel free to chime in when you feel like you've you've caught up.
Michelle, I just noticed Dave Ryan joining us, and
Yeah.
he had his hand up. Maybe we can include.
Okay, we'll start with David.
Actually, I was just adjusting my light so that you could see me. My apologies. I actually have been on for about a half hour, and dawned on me I had to let Jordan know that I needed to be moved into being a panelist. So I'm just still catching up. So please don't mind me. My apologies for being late. Thunderstorm slowed us down.
Good. Oh, good. Anything else folks want to note? Corinne? And then Bill?
Just a quick comment. I'm wondering if Vermont uses their requirement for continuous improvement plans that each district needs to write. And I just would hope that we don't go down that road, because it comes back to No Child Left Behind and the list of failing schools versus those who aren't failing. And just wanted to note that was a piece of their funding part.
Thanks, Corinne. Bill?
I'd like to echo something Dick said about requesting AIR to put a tangible example on the table, because I think it is unbelievably difficult to comment on mechanics of what a recommendation might look like without seeing some kind of numbers or example as to how the machinery works. And in particular, I have no surprise to anyone, I would like to request that when AIR does this, I'm thinking of both Bruce and Drew, your New York City study that you published, I think it's unbelievably important to give us tools to evaluate on, levers or toggles that can enhance progressivity of our distribution to districts, students, families that are most in need. I think that it's vital that we see ways to improve New Hampshire, which did so poorly, on that scale in Bruce's February 2020 study. We have to produce a better result than that. And I'd like to see specifically and ask for tools. Give us 5 methods of enhancing progressivity, targeting aid to the greatest need. Thank you.
So if I could just respond, excellent request. Part of our charge in our contract is to develop a simulation tool for you, or to develop basically a formula simulations for you. And we're planning on trying to put together a simulator for you with the nice little levers, as you call them, where you can change the parameters. And we did something similar in Vermont. So I'm not sure if you've seen that yet, but we can certainly send you it's been made public by the Vermont AOE.
I should have looked for it. I'm sorry, Jesse.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We'll make sure that the commission gets a copy. Okay.
Thank you. Other folks? It's a free-for-all now. We have about 7 minutes. Chris.
One thing I haven't heard people talk about, I'd be interested to know whether people think it's a good idea. I've noticed with a number of the states that have made improvements in the last couple of years that within areas like ELL, students with disabilities, poverty, there's an attempt to scale need within those areas, or scale relative effect within those areas. And I haven't heard anybody mention that. That seemed to me to be one of the markers that, is true of a number of these places. And that would seem to be one of the differences between, the more simple approach that we have, even to the point of sometimes then crossing that with concentration, like the way Maine addresses concentration of English learner students within a district. And if that's something that both the concentration as well as the scaling of intensity within need.
Thanks, Chris. Dick?
Not quick enough with this unmute button. I was interested in Jesse's comment about the importance of accountability accompanying a foundation system, and it makes sense to me. And I'd be interested, Jesse, if you have more to offer specifically around that. And on categoricals, special ed, there's high-end special ed and there's special ed. And it has always struck me that it makes sense to have in the sort of base formula plus weights, special ed, some weight for it across the board. And some years school districts will have more and some years they'll have less. But for the high end, these are kids that are really struggling, and we're talking about a couple of 100,000 or more a year. One or two kids can mess up a local budget big time. Wouldn't you really need to have a categorical program, as we do here in New Hampshire, not always fully funded, by the way, for the high-end special needs kids?
Thanks, Dick. Iris?
Yeah, we did have different weights originally for special ed students, depending on their placement, whether they were placed full-time in special education or part-time. I don't remember how we defined it, but that was a consideration. I agree it should be going forward.
Thanks. Jane?
I would support that and emphasize the need for not only the categories, but also taking into consideration students who are with disabilities who are attending charter schools and the cost incurred by the local school districts to cover that, as well as your kids who are court ordered and those who are placed out of state.
Anyone else before we move to the next piece? Iris again.
Yeah, just mentioning charter schools, there's a whole other area we haven't gotten into very much, but we currently give charter schools a much higher per pupil funding than we do other public schools. And I'd like to know whether that's common practice, what some other approaches we might take to that.
Thanks, Iris. Corinne, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Bruce.
Just to add to the special ed discussion, if there's a certain value placed on a teacher that can have 25 or 30 kids in a classroom, for special ed teachers, they have a ratio of 1:8. So you might have 20 students, but you've got to have more teachers for those 20 students than you do in a regular classroom, and there's no mechanism to supplement that cost either. And Jane can correct me if I'm wrong, but you need more special ed teachers because of the number of ratio of kids that are required for one educator.
Yeah, our special ed rules do dictate that in terms of your more self-contained programs. There's a limit on the number of kids that you can have and requirements on specific teachers and their qualifications.
Right.
So I guess, Rick, one more comment and then we'll.
It's just a comment. I'd like to tag in on the special ed component here. As a school administrator, when I was up in Alaska, we did get more funding for kids which were on almost like a one-to-one in special education. Be it something very severe within speech pathology, audiology, or a kid that's in the resource room and they're just getting a half hour a day maybe of reading. Obviously, you don't fund both of those categories the same, but I'm curious to know if there are some states out there which have broken down special education services so that those are really in need, the funding comes along, other than what we have right now, the categorical aid, the special education aid we call it now, where you have 3.5 times the average student cost, up to 10 times. That comes out of the general fund, as does the CTE. It doesn't come out of the education trust. And so we've just excluded it from adequacy. Should it be put back underneath the umbrella where it belongs and then weighted properly?
So this has been a really kind of a remarkable midsummer harvest of the garden of ideas that we're growing here with the commission. Some convergence and then a number of questions and frankly uncertainties, which is where we should be at this point. We shouldn't be nailing ourselves down into any particular boxes or corners. Mary and others have asked us to think outside the box as we go through this. Others of you have cited the recommendations and statutes that have been enacted in the past that we still haven't yet fully realized over time. And so part of our call here is to put into place a set of recommendations that can live and that can be on a regular basis revisited and adjusted as needed. But thanks to our AIR colleagues for giving us the material that led to this kind of, as I say, sort of harvesting today. And before I ask Carrie to sort of set up, sort of whet your appetite, I'm going with a lot of food metaphors here, I guess, for the focus group themes that we're also harvesting right now. I'll just remind you that 2 weeks from today, the full commission will be in an extended meeting from 1 o'clock until 4:30 without presenters, and to really take today's conversation 2 or 3 steps forward in terms of really digging deeper into all of the topics, questions, issues that have been raised today, but of course that have been raised over since the time we began meeting in January, minus our little COVID hiatus. But on a call earlier today with the leadership group, we sort of identified the multiple themes or threads that are now taking on some clarity, connecting those threads to each other and recognizing the inherent conflicts that are within some of these different pathways that we can pursue is also part of the challenge as well. Iris, you raised your hand, so just a quick comment before I ask Carrie to summarize some focus group themes.
Just a question on the calendar. Is next week's calendar just a Monday 2 to 4 meeting of the full group, or are there committee meetings? And when are the committee meetings next happening?
The work group meetings will meet again this week on Thursday. And I'll make sure, and Jordan will make sure that everybody gets a reminder of that. I think, and then beyond that, we have a full commission meeting both next Monday and the following Monday. Right now, the next work group meetings will be August 3rd. If individual work groups choose to add an additional meeting during the week between now and August 3rd, that'll be up to you and your work group chairs. We'll send out a reminder and confirmation of all of the schedule as we know it at this point. So with that, Carrie will describe some important input that we've received from local officials who manage school budgets, school and municipal leaders, as it says on Carrie's first slide. So with that, Carrie, it's yours for the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Hey, everybody. So a lot of what people brought up when we did the round robins and the conversation that was just had is really in line with what school and municipal leaders have been talking about, that we, during the focus groups that we conducted, New Hampshire Listens and the Kersey School staff in June 2020. So in June 2020, we conducted 12 online focus groups via Zoom with municipal and school leaders. Each lasted about 90 minutes, and there was a total of 48 participants. Hopefully everybody can see this. So if you look, all the counties in New Hampshire were represented except for Carroll County. And on the majority, it was school board members who attended, followed by select board, superintendent, principals, budget committee members, and then city council members. Most participation came from Merrimack, Rockingham, and Stratford County, and Grafton, and then was kind of dispersed through the other counties. Again, Carroll County was missing. I'll just let people have a second there. These are the communities that were represented, and then the numbers in parentheses are how many people from that community. So you can see they're both large and small communities, as well as more wealthy and less wealthy communities. You can take a look based on your knowledge of those communities. So some of the initial themes from the focus group findings from the notes that we took is people found the reliance on property taxes problematic overall. And this was from both property rich and property poor communities in terms of the rates. They felt like there need to consider definitions of adequacy and what remains funded and unfunded currently and what is needed in different communities. There's definitely concerns about funding in terms of inequities. For example, in the areas of staffing, teacher salaries, which were brought up, transportation, facilities, supplies, benefits, many of the topics that all of you brought up in your comments just now. And then just this need to find a systemic solution for funding and investing in school and educational adequacy, equity, and communities for all students. So it's very, very broad themes. So some of the examples, one area of example, and people brought this up, AIR also brought this up, is this unique community needs and resources. School leaders brought up and town leaders that they're managing diverse needs and demographics, especially when districts and SAUs have towns that vary in size and in terms of property available and space that you're able to build in. Some communities don't have any space to build more property. The consistent realization that New Hampshire's population is slanted towards an older population who no longer have kids in the school system, maybe grandchildren, and are working on a different fixed income. And so the cost of housing for them is a consideration and concern. There's concerns about closing local schools like small elementary schools in favor of regionalism, but there was also acknowledged benefits to regional schools. I think someone in the conversation brought up county approaches, and that was also brought up in the focus groups. Wealthier communities acknowledge that there are inequities, and lower communities clearly talked about struggling with adequacy themselves. In terms of costs of funding and definitions of adequacy, I think what these findings are really showing is that a lot of what you've all talked about, what the briefs are showing, and really the overall conversation is that what school municipal leaders are talking about is very similar to what we've been discussing here. So in terms of costs and funding and definitions of adequacy, adequacy including disparities and outcomes. So people talked about special education, students in poverty, ESOL learners, student learning needs and opportunities and outcomes vary by community. Teacher quality and salaries matter. That was something that was brought up quite a bit. Access to electives and extracurriculars vary by community. That's where some of the regionality came in that was beneficial. The need for supports and specialists require creativity in some communities in terms of providing social, emotional learning, trauma-informed care, behavioral supports in schools. And again, the focus on infrastructure, transportation, supplies and equipment, technology, especially technology as remote learning has become more of a focus during this time. Special education and the unanticipated out-of-district costs, the community members really talked about, or the leaders talked about, the unanticipated costs of placing students out of district, the challenge of discussing these matters because of the small population of out-of-district placements, and it kind of puts a target on families and students, which was people didn't like. So it's a challenge to talk about that, but also acknowledging that it is a burden. Reliance on grants for improvement. It's hard to make long-term plans when you're moving from grant to grant to grant for that extra funding if you locally can afford it. And then just continuing to make considerations for smaller communities, for instance, in terms of transportation and busing and that sort of thing. So these findings and themes aren't conclusive. They're to show what you all have talked about is similar to what community members or community leaders are thinking about. And we'll have more information as time goes by. So forthcoming reports from the engagement work group, data and next steps. So we will be publishing, we'll put these slides online so people can just have a sense of them. And then also there will be a report written, a more formal report, which will also be on the commission website. We just closed a school employee and district survey. We had over, it says 1,600 here, but it's actually over 1,700 respondents. And so we'll be analyzing those findings over the next few weeks. And then also our next step is to put together some questions for the UNH Grant State Poll, which will go out to communities in a broader way. So those are the next steps. And then the questions are in the next slide, but you can look at those online. And so that's all I have to share right now. Hope that's helpful.
So Dave, I'll turn it back to you. And
Great. Well, thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Bruce. And Mel, thanks for your leadership and in driving forward the public engagement piece. That's some great information there. On our original agenda, we wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time. We're not going to get to it today, but sort of what things do we want to do in the calendar going forward now that we're sort of halfway through the calendar of this commission's work. And Bruce, is that something we're going to take up next Monday?
Well, actually 2 weeks from today. So
all right,
that kind of midpoint
at the retreat. Yeah.
What have we learned, and what do we need to know more, and really what are our benchmarks going to be, particularly in August and September, leading up to a time in October and November to really begin to deliberate and identify the recommendations that will come out of the report. And I did want to comment that we, Dave and Jay and Mel, are aware that we do need to hear from the charter school community, and we need to better integrate the ways in which students are funded and charter schools are funded into our overall picture here in terms of what that might look like for recommendations going out. So we'll be hearing from the charter school community one way or another within the next few weeks, I'm sure.
Maybe to that point, Bruce, we know that there's an association of charter schools. Yes. We're going to invite that lead person. But if there's another perspective, without getting too deep into 29 different school administrators, it might be helpful to pass some information to Bruce.
Yes.
That'd be good. Thanks very much, Jay. So, I know we've got work groups on Thursday. In fiscal policy, we're going to be starting to talk about what things we want to have modeled for us, and so we're going to start getting into the weeds on things. So I think we got some exciting times ahead for sure. Right now, though, we want to open up the floor to members of the community, members of the public who've joined us today, to if they want to share some brief thoughts. Again, there'll be a longer format on Wednesday at 4 o'clock. But if anybody participating from the public today wants to add something right now, particularly based on what you heard today, please either raise your hand if you're on Zoom, or if you're dialed in, it's *9. So I'm not seeing any at the moment. And if I don't see any soon, we're going to all be able to get out a few minutes early. So I think people are looking forward to Wednesday, Bruce.
Yeah, that's good. We hope people take advantage of it. We'll try to get the word out as far as we can.
So does anybody else have anything to add for the good of the cause? Well, then we'll wrap things up for this afternoon, and anybody that can join us Wednesday, more than welcome to. That link will go out, and then we'll see everybody work groups on Thursday. So enjoy the week, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.